Right, guys, good morning. I hope you had a much better morning than I have. Basically, I woke up this morning to find that my dog had pooed all over the house. So the first half an hour of my day was spent with rubber gloves on, a bucket disinfectant, clearing up dog diarrhea. So I thought, what better way to cheer myself up and to cheer you guys up than to do a presentation and a lesson on Henry VII. Now, if you're wondering why I'm doing this presentation now, after you've done the essay on Henry, it's basically to make sure that in your head it's all correct, and also to hopefully answer a few little questions you might have about the details about Henry and whatever rebellions he faced. So I'll try and make this as quick as possible, but there is a few confusing bits and a bit of detail. So any questions you have, please either put it on Google or put in an email to me, whatever it might be. Alternatively, I'm more than happy to meet up in small groups or one-to-one and do a little tutorial to answer any questions you might have. Now remember, okay, when it comes to the coursework and the question you're doing, whether it's about the causes of rebellion or whether you choose something else, you might choose something like rebellions were more extreme the further from London they were. How far do you agree? So whatever you choose, you're not going to need to know everything about the Tudors. Yes, you've got 4,500 words, but trust me, that will go quite fast. So you need to stay focused on what your question is, on the argument and the counter argument. So don't worry. I know there's loads of Henrys, there's loads of Richards, there's loads of marriages, divorces, children, and it's all sort of interlinked, intertwined, and incestual. I know all that. Okay, so don't worry. If you get confused, I've been confused with this loads of times. Don't panic. You probably won't need the majority of it for your essay. So a little bit of background about Henry, and then we'll crack on with the rebellions. So Henry becomes king. Remember, Henry was from the Lancashire side of the War of the Roses. Richard was from the Yorkist side of the War of the Roses. And the War of the Roses had been a bloody battle between two major families for decades. And it finally ended when Richard III was killed by Henry at the Battle of Bosworth. Okay. Now, the reason why Henry faces more dynastic and mainly political rebellions than any other king during Tudor times is because his claim to the throne was so weak. Okay, now I've put down there's 5 people who had a claim to the throne. The majority of them were alive, 2 of them potentially not at this time. Now I'm going to spend a few minutes going into a little bit about each of them, and then hopefully it'll make you understand why certain rebellions choose those people to try and use as a pretender. So the Earl of Warwick was alive and probably should have been next in line. He was heir to the throne of Richard, and I'll explain why in a minute. John de la Pole and Edmund de la Pole were the nephews of Richard and Edward, okay, the 2 previous kings. So they believe that they have a very strong claim to the throne. And the sort of odd one out, or the one that is caused historians to debate for centuries, is the princes in the Tower. Edward V and Richard, were they alive or had they been killed by Richard III? So hopefully this is the most confusing bit, but I hope it makes sense to you. So as you can see here, we've got, I've circled in green Edward IV. Okay, so he was the last king before Richard. Now when Edward dies, okay, he has 2 sons, Edward and Richard. Now his brother, so Edward IV's brother, Richard's job was to ensure that his sons, Edward and Richard, were prepared to be king. Okay. Now Richard, because he had no surviving children, his only son died as a child. Richard instead wanted power for himself. He didn't want to prepare the boys to be king. So instead, when Edward IV died, Richard locks up his nephews, Edward and Richard, and they become the princes in the Tower. Now, the reason why, if you look at Edward and Richard again, the reason why there's a question mark next to the year of their death is because we think that Richard had them killed almost immediately while they were in the Tower. Now, interestingly, in 1933, so like 500 years later, in a abbey called Chapel in the Abbey, there was an urn or 2 urns that were dug up near to where the tower was, and we believe that they were the 13 and 10-year-old bodies of Edward and Richard. Okay, so we're pretty confident that Richard himself killed or ordered the death of the 2 boys. Now, don't get confused. here, I've just changed the picture to one that allows you to see why it was a bit more complex. If you look at that middle line there, so far left, you've got Edward, the same one we spoke about in the last slide, and Richard. Now, they were one of many siblings. Now, Edward and Richard got on very well as brothers, but George, the one you can see next to Richard, actually was executed for treason. George had gone to the Lancashire side and then come back to the Yorkshire side. He was quite a jealous, obsessive brother, and so he was killed, we think executed in, the rumour has it, in Moresby Wine. Now, he left one son, Edward, Earl of Warwick. So now this is a little bit confusing. Okay, so Edward's died, Richard has locked up Edward's children. Now, what about Edward, Earl of Warwick? Well, actually, because Richard did not have any sons or daughters of his own, he actually names Edward, Earl of Warwick, as his heir. So that's why Edward, Earl of Warwick, is a real thorn in the side of Henry VII, and one of the reasons why Lambert Simnel is chosen to impersonate him, because he's the most likely person to take the throne. He is next in line, he's next heir, so it makes the most sense. And that's the reason why Henry VII locks him up straight away. So the other problems he faced, the north was still a Yorkish stronghold, and all the noblemen around there, a lot of them had their own personal armies that would only fight for them. They didn't fight for the king, they fought for their noblemen. England was also incredibly poor, and the majority of trade went through the south in London and also Norwich. And that was a consequence of the War of the Roses. And also England had a very poor relationship with the rest of Europe, in particular Spain and France, but also there was constant trouble with Ireland. So some solutions Henry brings in. The first thing is he marries Elizabeth, Duke of York. So if I go back briefly here, you can see Henry has married Edward's daughter. Okay, so that is a Lancashire king, Henry VII, marrying the daughter of a Yorkist king, Elizabeth, in the hope that it would unite the two families and hopefully go some way to repairing some of the damage done in the past. That's why the Tudor rose is a combination of the white and the red rose. Also in 1499, Henry negotiates the marriage of his son Arthur to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. Now, this was to try and improve relationships between the two countries, and it worked an absolute treat. So that's one of the greatest things he does. And if you remember rightly, when Arthur dies, Henry VIII ends up marrying his widow Catherine of Aragon. One of Henry VII's most shrewdest capabilities was his economical mind. Okay, he was one of the last kings ever to actually leave some sort of profit behind. Okay, he was very, very shrewd, a lot shrewder than his son Henry VIII. So he brings in the Star Chamber, which is where you can be fined in like a law of court, and that money goes towards the crown's money. Custom duties, again, putting money or taxes like an extra charge on top of things coming into the country. Forced loans with the people and noblemen, and also selling off huge chunks of Yorkist land. Now, he knew deep down this would cause resentment between the Yorkists and himself, but it made him so much money and allowed him to put that money back into the land. And in 1503, he also bans private armies. There's no such thing as a private army for a nobleman. They fight, hopefully, for the king. So our first rebellion, dead simple, 1486, the Lovell and Stafford Rebellion. So this is a political uprising by one of Richard's main councillors, Lord Lovell and the Stafford brothers. So the three men had lost power, had lost some land under Henry, and they wanted a Yorkist king in place. The problem is unlike Lambert Simnel and unlike most other rebellions, they didn't really have a contingency plan, as in they didn't have anybody to rally around, and that's why it goes so wrong. You know, people, noblemen, even the peasantry, the gentry, the middle classes, they'll rally behind someone who's got a plan in place or have got a pretender in place at least. They did not have that. So what actually happened? Well, Lord Lovell actually left his sanctuary in Colchester. Sanctuary meant that basically in monasteries or abbeys or places of worship, it was thought that you would be safe from persecution if you stayed there in certain places. He left that and went to try and raise support in Yorkshire, while the Stafford brothers went to Worcester to also raise support. Henry VII had spies all over England, and he caught wind of this and sent his uncle Jasper Tudor to sort it out. Lord Lovell hears of this and he flees to Margaret of Burgundy. Now, Margaret of Burgundy plays a much larger role in other rebellions. She never herself actually lands in England, but she was Richard's sister, so she would do anything to see Henry removed from power and have a Yorkist king back in power. So she would send armies, money, protection, whatever it is, to see Henry gone. The eldest Stafford brother is executed, but Lord Lovell gets away and would soon be involved in this Lambert-Simnel rebellion. So the Lambert-Simnel rebellion is once again a political and dynastic rebellion that this time has a pretender. Now, it was thought, first of all, that this young boy, Lambert Simnel, who was being tutored by a guy called Richard Simmons, his look and the way he did things, he had learnt to almost act like royalty, and he was the perfect person, he thought, to try and impersonate one of the princes in the Tower. However, Richard Simmons then had a change of thought. Many people around that time believed that the princes were actually killed anyway, so they believed instead the perfect person would be to impersonate Edward, not Earl of Warwick, sorry, typo, Earl of Warwick, and he was Richard's heir, who Henry locks up as soon as he comes to power. So it's probably a wise choice to pick Edward over the two boys. The problem is, while there was while there was even a hint that the princes or Edward were alive, there would always be potential for rebellion, because everybody in England knew, especially Yorkists, that those three boys had a much stronger claim to the throne than him. So the other reason, just very briefly, the other reason why a lot of people had a problem with Henry and probably wouldn't mind him being removed is because his claim, his personal claim to the throne, was actually very, very flimsy. If you think, his great-great-grandfather was the son of Edward III, which obviously means he's got royal blood, but then his grandfather actually marries the widow of the king at the time in secrecy, and there's also an illegitimate child, which means that basically Henry VII's family was barred from ever being king or ever being a monarch. So that's why he really was a shock to everybody when he becomes king. So you can see there the main cause is all about politics. Okay, so although Henry had pardoned a lot of Richard's sympathisers, a lot of Yorkists had lost their land. What Henry had done, he didn't go in too strong with the Yorkists. If he came in straight away and took away all their land and punished people and executed, he knew it would lead to a much, much bigger rebellion. So the reason why Lambert Simnel is taken to Ireland, first of all, is because Richard, okay, the last king, had basically allowed Ireland to virtually run themselves as they wanted. Okay, they were treated like an independent country. Now, they feared that now a new king had come in from the different side of the War of the Roses, that might all change. So that's why a lot of support comes from Ireland itself. So again, just a reminder, Lambert Simnel is not impersonating one of the two princes in the Tower. Instead, he's impersonating the son of George, Duke of Clarence, okay, and that was the heir to Richard III. So he's impersonating Edward, Earl of Warwick. So what happened? Simnel, this young boy who was basically a puppet, okay, he didn't really have any idea why or what he was doing. He was completely under the control of Richard Simmons. He's taken to Dublin, where the Irish chiefs, actually, whether they believe him or not, it doesn't really matter. They claim that he is the real Earl of Warwick. Margaret, the Duchess of Burgundy, remember Richard's sister, she sends 2,000 mercenaries, so that's paid soldiers, to the rebellion. And John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, joined the rebellion. Now, interestingly, Henry had tried to be fair with John de la Pole. So even though John de la Pole was the nephew of Richard III and Edward IV, he makes him a nobleman in the hope that in the hope that John de la Pole could bring some of the Yorkists round to his way of thinking. Instead, John de la Pole joins the first rebellion he has chance to. So amazingly, Henry pulls the real Earl of Warwick, not Earl of Warwick, Earl of Warwick, out of prison and parades him around London. Now, to you and me and to anybody else, this would be enough to understand that the Earl of Warwick that they've got in Ireland is an imposter. But remember, people didn't necessarily believe that Lambert Simnel was really royalty. They just wanted Henry gone. So that's why a lot of people outside London chose not to believe that Henry had the real one. So the Battle of Stoke was one of the biggest battles in all of the rebellions. He had 8,000 men on the rebel side, and Henry mustered together 12,000 men. At one point, it looked as if Henry might lose, but in truth, the royal army was always in control. A very bloody battle, and in the end, Henry's men win. The Earl of Lincoln, John de la Pole, was killed in battle, and any nobles who had supported him had their land stripped. Henry didn't go too harsh on the rest of the people. He pardoned quite a lot. He realised just how volatile the North had become. And one of the favourite bits of the story is Lambert Simnel is made to work in his kitchen. Henry realised he had nothing to do with it. So in the aftermath, that is when you've got to think. At this time, England has changed hands of kings 3 times in 3 years. So another change would not have been a massive shock. On the flip side of that, people in Tudor times, you can see at the bottom there, they're exhausted. Okay, at the start of the Tudors, they've gone through War of the Roses. There's poverty. There's been very, very poor crop yield, and so people just want some sort of normality, some sort of just calmness rather than the constant threat of war. And you can see the second bullet point there. His treatment of the nobility after Bosworth was effective. Yes, he executed a few, but actually he gave a lot of people a choice. If you support me, I will let you keep your land and keep your position. But obviously that means that if you do cross me, then you will be executed. So especially you can see there that Earl of Northumberland, who had fought by Richard's side at Bosworth, he stayed loyal throughout the whole rebellion. So that showed Henry that even these strong Yorkist noblemen could be persuaded. Now, I thought I'd also include a few sources to show you how it might be used in case you come across them in your own research. You can see there John Guy, a very famous book called Tudor England. He basically talks about how that of all the rebellions that Henry VII faced, the most serious was Lambert Simnel. And I'm not going to read it out to you, you can read that yourself. But again, you can imagine in your essay, if you're trying to prove that political or dynastic rebellions were the most fearful for the king, then you might use something like that to back it up. Okay, and then to go a step further, you could analyse why John Guy might be saying that. Where's he got, as a historian, where's he got his information from, to try and back up what you're saying. So remember, with your essay, you don't have to just keep supporting one side. You want half your essay supporting the statement and the other half counter-arguing the statement. Right, the Yorkshire Rebellion, a purely economical one. A subsidy is a forced loan. So Henry VII had tried to force people to pay £100,000 that's granted by Parliament in a war against France. Now, why? Sorry, I guess water. Now, why did Henry want to be involved in a war against France? Well, he wanted to help Brittany out. Brittany was fighting against France to try and gain independence, and Brittany had sheltered Henry during the War of the Roses, so he felt like he owed them something back. Now you can see how unpopular this subsidy was. Only 27 grand was raised in the north out of 100,000. So why were the people of Yorkshire so much against it? Well, first of all, Yorkshire obviously was the York stronghold. They hated the idea of Henry being in power in the first place, let alone being asked to give such a high amount. Secondly, they were probably the worst hit area of the poor harvest in the previous 2 years. So quite frankly, they didn't have the money to pay. And finally, other northern counties around Yorkshire did not have to pay this subsidy. And the excuse was that they had to pay money to protect themselves against the Scots. So Yorkshire were puzzled as to why they were paying more than other northern counties, even though they were just as at risk as others were. So they felt victimised. So what happened? Henry Percy, who had shown his loyalty to Henry, the Earl of Northumberland, was sent to enforce this subsidy and ended up being murdered by the rebels. So the rebels were led by Sir John, I think it's Egerman, the Earl of Surrey. Sorry, Sir John Egerman. Now the Earl of Surrey, again, who had stayed loyal to Henry, very, very easily put down this rebellion. So unlike Lambert Simnel, there's no massive battle, there's no equivalent to the Battle of Stoke. Instead, this seems like it's sort of like a riot gone wrong, because a riot gone wrong. It's not a planned army, it's not a planned invasion or foreign support, anything like that. It's just instead they want to not pay the tax. It's as simple as that. The people of Yorkshire just want to enter the tax. They don't want to see Henry removed. They just want the tax, the subsidy, to be removed. So in the aftermath, there was no more effort to collect that tax or subsidy from Yorkshire. There were some executions, but again, Henry gives the leaders or the leader a chance for remorse, and instead he showed his loyalty and later received several manors from him, several large homes. Henry recognises that Yorkshire is very much feeling more and more isolated from London, so he actually spends more time there, and he also establishes what's called the Tudor Council of the North, so almost like a mini meeting, a mini parliament within Yorkshire. A very similar rebellion is the Cornish Rebellion in 1497. Now, Cornwall felt distant from London for many reasons, not only geographically, but also the fact that people of Cornwall, even the 1400s, still spoke their own language. They had their own parliament and their own law courts. They very much ran their part of the country by themselves. Now, think about it. Because of their geography, they are more bothered about France than Scotland. Now, Henry VII, on the flip side of this, was becoming more worried about Scotland than he was about France. So Parliament allowed a £60,000 subsidy in what's called 2/15 and 10th, so that's money taken from earnings. Now, this was 3 times the amount of any earlier amount asked for by Henry. Now, the reason why Henry was more bothered about Scotland than he was about France is because of the rise of Park in Warbeck, which we'll look at in a minute. But the truth is, the people of Cornwall are about 600 miles from that, so they don't feel the need to pay for something that probably won't affect them. So what happened? The Cornish basically refused to pay and marched north under the leadership of Lord Audley and Flamank, who was a lawyer. Now, amazingly, they did incredibly to march that far and gain support on the way. Now, when they reached London, thankfully for Henry, the Londoners would not open the city gates. And understandably, Devon and Kent, who the Cornishmen went or visited along the way, they hoped that they would come to their assistance. They didn't. So they chose a very specific site to camp at outside London. The rebels camped a place called Blackheath. Okay, now Blackheath was involved in the Peasants' Rebellion in 1381, many years before, but it's got quite a symbolic site that is known for rebellion. Henry actually mustered 20,000 men and crushed the rebellion very, very violently, killing about 1,000 rebels. So yes, the Cornish had done very well to get to London and actually stayed strong and waited there, but when they heard that Henry with such a large army was coming, a lot of them fled. In the aftermath, the leaders are executed, and you can see now Henry's being more fierce and more strict with his punishments. Now, Cornwall remains anti-London and anti-Henry, and that's shown by the fact that they back Park in Warbeck in the next rebellion. And Henry was very much concerned at how easily the rebels had gone through the south of England to get to London. Why had no other nobleman stopped them on their way? An example here of a primary source. Okay, so in your essay, if you want to try and show that Henry was strict in some times, but also more lenient at other times, then you might argue that this is evidence of where Henry showed his leniency towards rebels. So that's the pardon of 2 of the Cornish rebels and commanding that their goods should be returned to them. So even though you can't read it, wherever, I can't remember where I got that source from, it's got a transcript below it, so you can put that in what's called your appendix of the essay and then refer to it in your argument. And finally, the Perkin-Warbeck Rebellion. Now, this is an interesting one. This lasts over 8 years. The reason why it lasts about 8 years is because Perkin Warbeck never really goes away. Okay, he's like a fly in the side of fly on the side. He's a fly to Henry VII. He can't quite squat. So he pretends to be the youngest of the two twins in the tower. Now, why would he choose to be the youngest of the two twins? I'll quickly go back to show you here. So the reason why he chooses to be Richard rather than Edward is because there was rumours that when Richard III had the boys locked up, they spared the younger boy, the younger son, the younger brother, because of his age, and that he somehow escaped. So it was more believable to be Richard than it was Edward. So that means that when he chose to be Richard, he then gets backing from the whole of Europe pretty much. Now, he's a much more, people believe at the time, he's a much more plausible, a better pretender than Simnel. And if you look down there to the backing he gets backing from Emperor Maximilian, he gets backing from the Scottish. Why? Because they're anti-English, they're anti-Henry. He gets backing from Margaret of Burgundy because, remember, Margaret of Burgundy will do anything to see Henry removed because he killed her brother in the Battle of Bosworth. Charles VIII, the King of France, hates the fact that Henry has backed Brittany over France, so he'll also back Perkin Warbeck. And finally, the Earl of Desmond, who was helping to run Ireland, again, they're anti-Lancashire and anti-Henry because they want to rule their own country like it used to be under Richard. So I'm not going to go through each of them bit by bit. Okay, these are the 5 main attempts that Perkin Warbeck tries to take power or tries to get help on the way to become king. Okay, now some of them are absolutely farcical, like when he tries to land at Kent and actually can't even land the boat himself. He never actually sets foot on land during the invasion. There's one there about Scotland and also about in Cornwall where it gets a bit more support. The truth is, I'll let you read that in your own time. The truth is, Perkin Warbeck was never really fully supported as a pretender. He was just almost used, he was kind of like used as a pawn by the other European leaders to try and get their way. Okay, so he relied purely on others to try and come to power. He had no army of himself. He had no real support from the English people. Instead, he's relied on the power of others. You can see there his power starts to fade away, especially after Kent, and also after the Cornish Rebellion. He pretty much goes into to become insignificant. So by that time as well, Henry's much more secure on the throne, and a lot of noblemen are not willing to risk their land or their power over this random lad. And also by this point, bear in mind, Henry's been in charge about 10 years. By the end of this, he's got a very, very highly trained intelligence service, and people are now more loyal to him because they found that he's pardoned a lot of people and then also given them land and title, and in return they give him protection. So that's the end of all the rebellions. So hopefully that helped a little bit. I apologise if it got a bit confusing, but the start of Henry VII is arguably the most confusing bit of the whole Tudors, apart from a few things about succession later on. So any questions, let me know. But thanks for listening, and I will speak to you again soon. As soon as I can try and work out how to close it down.